ivory silk taffeta, 10,000 pearls and mother-of-pearl sequins sewn by hand, and a train 25 feet long, the longest ever made for a royal wedding, designed to unroll down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral like a river of light. It did not survive the carriage. On the morning of the 29th of July, 1981, a 19th-century glass coach carried a 20-year-old woman from Clarence House to Ludgate Hill, and the coach was too small for the dress. 25 feet of silk had to be folded and packed and pressed against her legs, against the seat, against the door, for the length of the journey. When she stepped out into the sunlight in front of 600,000 people, the silk came out creased. Deep, obvious, unmistakable creases running like fault lines through the most photographed dress in human history. Her two designers ran forward and knelt on the cathedral steps and smoothed it with their hands. They had perhaps 40 seconds. Then she began the walk. 3.5 minutes, up the longest aisle in Britain, on her father's arm, and from the far end of that cathedral, from the camera positions, from the 750 million people watching in 74 countries, it looked flawless. That is the entire marriage contained in one object on one morning. From 90 feet away, the most beautiful thing anyone had ever seen. From 6 inches away, crushed. What follows is 15 years lived at those two distances at once. 15 years in which an eating disorder began within weeks of the engagement and was not publicly named for more than a decade. 15 years with a third person in the room whose existence was denied, then admitted, then confirmed on national television by a future king. 15 years that produced 2 intercepted phone calls broadcast to a nation, a book a princess secretly wrote about herself, an interview watched by nearly 23 million people in Britain alone, a divorce that stripped her of the title she had been given in exchange for her life, and a death at 36 that turned all of it into scripture. And then, a quarter of a century later, an official inquiry concluding that the most famous act of truth-telling in the whole story had been obtained by forgery. So here is the question underneath everything, and it is not the one you would expect. She was not silent. That is the myth inside the myth. Diana Spencer was one of the most fluent, most instinctive communicators of the 20th century, and she was photographed more often than any other woman alive. So how does a person that visible, that articulate, spend 15 years unable to make anyone believe her? What does it do to someone to be looked at constantly and heard almost never? And when she finally forced the world to listen, what did the listening cost? Settle in. We are going to look at this one up close. She was born on the 1st of July, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham estate, in a bed that the Queen's family owned. The Spencers had leased the house from the Crown since before she was born. Her father would take her, as a small girl, to watch the royal family arrive for Christmas. She grew up on the edge of the story she would eventually be swallowed by. But the important fact about her birth is who was missing from it. Before Diana, there were 2 daughters, Sarah and Jane. And then, in January of 1960, a son, John, who lived for around 10 hours. The Spencers were an old aristocratic family with an earldom, an estate, and a legal problem. Without a male heir, the whole apparatus passed sideways to a cousin. According to the account Diana later gave, her mother was sent to Harley Street specialist to determine what was wrong with her, on the assumption that the failure to produce a living son was a defect in the woman. That account cannot be checked now. What is verifiable is the shape of the household, a third daughter, arriving 18 months after a dead son, into a family that needed something else. She was not given a name for a week. Her brother Charles, the heir they had been waiting for, arrived 3 years later. Then the marriage came apart. Her mother, Frances, left in 1967 when Diana was 6. The divorce came in 1969, and with it, a custody fight that ended in something close to a family execution. Diana's own maternal grandmother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, gave evidence in court on behalf of her son-in-law and against her daughter. Frances lost the children. Understand what that means as a formative fact. It is not simply that a child watched her parents divorce. It is that a child learned, at 6, that when a woman in her family made trouble, the women closest to her would line up on the side of the institution. That lesson would be taught to her again, in a much larger house, 20 years later. She described hearing footsteps on gravel the night her mother left, and the sound of her younger brother crying in the dark and not going to him. She did not remember the crying. She remembered not moving. One thread to keep hold of. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, the grandmother who testified against her own daughter, was a close friend and lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. 2 of the women who helped place Diana inside the House of Windsor were her own grandmother and her grandmother's employer. They met properly in November of 1977 in a plowed field at Althorpe. She was 16, he was 29, and he was there to shoot with her older sister Sarah, whom he was seeing at the time. Diana remembered him taking very little notice of her. The version of that afternoon that is hardened into legend, the one where something passes between them, has no source other than hindsight. The moment that actually mattered came almost 3 years later, in July of 1980, at a country weekend in Sussex. They sat together on a bale of hay and talked about Lord Mountbatten, Charles's great-uncle and closest mentor, who had been murdered by the IRA 11 months earlier. She told him she had watched him walk up the aisle at the funeral and thought he looked desperately sad, that he needed someone beside him. Every biographer of every persuasion treats that conversation as the hinge, because it is the only moment in the courtship where you can see clearly what each of them wanted. He wanted someone who noticed his loneliness. She wanted to be the person who noticed. Neither is love. Both are need, and need is a very convincing counterfeit at 19. What followed was not a courtship in any recognizable sense. It was an assessment. The press found her that November outside the kindergarten in Pimlico where she worked and produced the photograph that made her famous. A young woman holding 2 small children, standing in front of a bright window in a thin cotton skirt, the shape of her legs visible through it. She had not understood what the sun would do. She was mortified. The nation was charmed. It sets the pattern for everything after. Her private discomfort converted directly into public affection. Meanwhile, the vetting proceeded. Her uncle, Lord Fermoy, told journalists that his niece had no past. A member of her own family had briefed the press on her sexual inexperience as a job qualification. She was 20. They had met, by her own count, around 13 times before he proposed. Hold that number loosely. It comes from her, and she had reason to make the point. But no biographer has produced a version of the courtship in which they spent significant time alone. There was no stretch in which 2 people found out whether they liked each other, because that was never what the process was for. He proposed in February of 1981. She said yes at once. She was 20. He was 32, with a father reportedly pressing him to decide one way or the other, and a press pack that had spent a decade asking when the Prince of Wales would do his duty. And then came the engagement interview, and the 11 seconds that have haunted the story ever since. A reporter asked whether they were in love. She answered immediately, brightly, "Of course." He paused and said, "Whatever in love means." For 40 years, that line has been read as a confession, a man telling the truth in public because he could not tell it in private. Turn the sentence over, though. Read one way, it is exactly that. Read the other way, it is a self-conscious man in his 30s being asked a sentimental question by a television crew and refusing to perform. Dimbleby argues for something closer to the second, and then adds a detail that damages Charles far more than the quote does, that he went into the marriage full of doubt, confided as much to friends in writing, and felt the machinery around him had reached a point where refusal was no longer available. That is the ugliest possibility, and the one most of the evidence supports. Not a villain and a victim. 2 people who both understood the thing was already moving, and neither of whom could find the sentence that would stop it. She found one. Days before the wedding, according to the account she later gave, she came across a bracelet being prepared as a gift for another woman, engraved with the 2 letters that stood for the private nicknames Charles and Camilla used for each other. There was a row, and she told her sisters she could not go through with it. And her sister said the line that ought to be carved somewhere, because it is the entire British establishment in 14 words. "Bad luck, Dutch. Your face is on the tea towels." You are too late to chicken out. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, stood in the pulpit and told the congregation that this was the stuff of which fairy tales are made. He meant it as a blessing. It worked, in the end, as a diagnosis. She got his names in the wrong order in the vows. He omitted a word in his, promising his goods rather than all his worldly goods. Both slips have since been mined for meaning by people who already knew the ending. Be careful with that kind of reading, because anyone who has stood up in front of 600,000 people has fumbled a line. The telling detail is smaller and far less quoted. In the 5 months between the engagement and the wedding, she shrank. The dress had to be taken in repeatedly. Her designers have described altering it again and again as the fittings went on, remaking a garment to fit a body that would not stop changing. She has since said that her bulimia began in that period, and she connected the onset to a remark about her waist. 1 dress, several sizes, 5 months. That is what was happening under the silk, while the country ordered commemorative plates. The honeymoon was 2 weeks on the royal yacht Britannia in the Mediterranean, followed by weeks at Balmoral. And it is here that we hit the central evidentiary problem of this entire story, so let us name it once and carry it with us. Almost everything we know about the private interior of that marriage in its first decade comes from one of two sources: Diana or people speaking for Charles. There are no neutral witnesses in a marriage. What exists is two retrospective campaigns fought through intermediaries, plus a handful of household staff who saw fragments and later sold them. By her account, 2 photographs of Camilla Parker Bowles fell out of his diary on the yacht. By her account, he wore cufflinks engraved with 2 interlinked C's, a gift, and the answer she was given did not satisfy her. Both are single-sourced, and both are perfectly consistent with everything later confirmed by other means. That is where much of this has to live, not proven, not refuted, corroborated only by the shape of what came after. What is not in dispute is Balmoral. She was 20, 3 months into public life, and placed in a Scottish castle full of people who had known one another for 50 years, in a routine of shooting and dressing for dinner that had not changed since Victoria. He was happy there, she was not. Their tastes overlapped almost nowhere. That mismatch is not a crime. Half the marriages on Earth contain it. What made this one lethal was that it had no exit and an audience of millions. By the first Christmas, she was pregnant, and by her own later testimony, seriously unwell. In January of 1982, at Sandringham, she fell down a staircase. She said afterwards that she had told her husband how desperate she was, that he had not believed the seriousness of it, and that what happened on those stairs was an attempt to make the distress visible, the act of a person who has run out of words. The Queen reportedly found her. A doctor was called. The baby was unharmed. Handle this episode carefully, because it is the one most often flattened in the retelling. The account is hers, and others in the house have given differing versions of the sequence. What no version disputes is that a pregnant 20-year-old was found at the bottom of a staircase during a family Christmas, and that the household's response was to close around it and continue. Nobody called it a crisis. That is the mechanism I want you to see, because it is the real subject of this video. The family operated, and had operated for generations, on a principle usually summarized in 4 words: never complain, never explain. As a public relations doctrine, it had carried the monarchy through 2 world wars and a constitutional crisis. As a domestic environment for a clinically ill 20-year-old, it functioned as a gag. That is the silence in the title. It was not that she said nothing. It was that the system was built so that nothing she said could register as information. William was born in June of 1982, Harry in September of 1984. She said the marriage effectively ended after Harry's birth, that something in her closed. Others in the household date the collapse later. What the photographic record shows is a couple who, from around 1986 onwards, stop looking at each other. And 1986 is the year that everything in this story turns on. Camilla Parker Bowles had known Charles since the early 1970s. They had been involved before his naval service. She married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. He became godfather to her son. Here is the factual dispute, and it is the load-bearing one. Diana maintained that the relationship never stopped, that there was a third person in the marriage from the beginning, and that she was told she was imagining it. Dimbleby's 1994 biography, written with Charles's cooperation and read by many as his authorized answer, states that it resumed in 1986, after the marriage had, in that phrase which has done so much work ever since, irretrievably broken down. Everything depends on which of those you believe, because they describe 2 different crimes. One is a man who married a girl while attached to someone else and let her be told she was mad. The other is a man in a dead marriage who went back to the person he should have married in the first place. Notice, though, what both versions concede. Both agree the affair existed and that it was denied for years while it was happening. And in both, a woman in her 20s spent a long stretch of time being assured by her husband, her staff, and her in-laws that the thing she could plainly see was not there. There is a word for that now. There was not one in general use in 1986. She confronted Camilla directly at a party in 1989, at a house in southwest London, following her husband downstairs to do it. Her account of what she said is brief and has never been contradicted by anyone present, that she knew what was going on and that she would not be treated as an idiot. She then went back upstairs. That is the last moment in this story when the matter was still private. How does a person survive 9 years of that? She built 4 things, and each of them would later be used against her. The first was illness, which is not a coping mechanism so much as what arrives when there is none. Her bulimia ran, by her own account, for most of the decade. It went unnamed in public until 1992, and undiscussed by her until 1993. And here's what usually gets lost. She was not hiding it especially well. Staff knew, family knew. It was managed the way everything else in that house was managed, by not being said aloud. The second was work, and it is the reason we are still talking about her. In April of 1987, she opened Britain's first purpose-built ward for patients with HIV and AIDS at Middlesex Hospital, and shook a patient's hand without gloves in front of press photographers. Read it as theater if you like, many did. But in 1987, there were British hospitals leaving meals outside the door, undertakers refusing bodies, and a government information campaign built around a tombstone. One photograph, taken in about 4 seconds, did more to dismantle that than any leaflet. She had worked out something the institution around her had never needed to learn. The body communicates faster than the statement. The third was her sons, and a deliberate campaign to raise them differently. Theme parks, cinema queues, hospital visits, homeless shelters. It was the beginning of the end of a particular kind of royal childhood. The fourth was other people. James Hewitt, a cavalry officer from around 1986. James Gilby. Oliver Hoare. Later Hasnat Khan, whom several people close to her describe as the relationship that mattered most. She would confirm the Hewitt affair herself on television in 1995 in 4 words. Yes, she adored him. It was her only public admission of adultery, and she made it about a man who had already sold the story. Which brings us to 1992 and to the 2 photographs. By that year, they were effectively living apart. He at Highgrove, she at Kensington Palace, with the diaries managed so their paths crossed as little as possible. And in February, they were sent to India together because the tour had been arranged and canceling would have said too much. She was photographed alone on the bench in front of the Taj Mahal, a monument built by an emperor as a tomb for the wife he loved. She had chosen to sit there. She knew exactly what the picture said, and afterwards, asked what she had made of it, she called the experience very healing. It is the most sophisticated piece of visual communication by any Windsor of the 20th century. 8 weeks later, in Korea, the 2 of them were photographed looking so visibly miserable that the British papers nicknamed them the Glums. That one was not staged. And in between, on the 29th of March, her father died. She was in Austria, skiing. There was a dispute, briefed to the press within days by both households in incompatible versions, about whether her husband should accompany her home. One side said he insisted for appearances. The other said he offered out of kindness. Her father was dead, and both camps went to the newspapers about the travel arrangements. That is the point at which the marriage stopped being a marriage in trouble and became a war with a press strategy. In June of 1992, Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story. It described the bulimia, the despair, the years of being disbelieved, and it named Camilla Parker Bowles. The Palace called it fiction. She then let a photographer capture her leaving the house of one of the named sources, which was as close to a signature as she could give. She had, in fact, written it, not with a pen, but by recording answers to written questions on cassettes, carried back and forth by an old friend named James Colthurst, who cycled to Kensington Palace and wrote out again with the tapes. The system was designed so that she could deny it. She did, and the denial held until she was dead. The transcripts were published in 1997. In August, a newspaper printed a transcript of an intercepted telephone call between Diana and James Gilby, recorded on New Year's Eve of 1989. In January of 1993, a different paper printed an intercepted call between Charles and Camilla from December of the same year. The second was humiliating in a way that is still, 3 decades on, the first thing many people remember about him. Consider the provenance, because almost nobody does. 2 private calls, recorded years before publication by unidentified parties, surfacing within 5 months of each other at the precise moment the marriage was being fought out in public. The official explanation was radio hobbyist with scanners. Technical objections to that account have never been satisfactorily answered, and no investigation has ever established who made the tapes or how they reached the newspapers. It is the largest unexplained hole in the record, and it is usually skipped because the contents were more entertaining than the question. On the 9th of December 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, rose in the House of Commons and announced the separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales to Parliament. He added that there was no reason the princess should not in due course be crowned queen. Nobody believed that sentence, including, one suspects, the man reading it. Now look at what was happening to the other side of the arrangement, because the institution was not surviving this either. 1992 had already taken the marriages of two of the Queen's other children. In November, Windsor Castle caught fire and burned for 15 hours. A government minister suggested the taxpayer would fund the repairs, and the public reaction was so hostile that the position collapsed within days. 4 days after the fire, at a lunch in the City of London, the Queen said that the year was not one she would look back on with undiluted pleasure, and used the Latin phrase that led every front page the next morning, annus horribilis. Within a fortnight, it was announced that she would begin paying income tax. Within a month, the separation. This is what makes the story larger than a marriage. A single, unhappy woman with no institutional power, no allies inside the household, and no title beyond the one they had given her, had put the oldest surviving monarchy in Europe into its worst crisis since the abdication, using the only instrument she had ever been handed, a face people wanted to look at. Then, in June of 1994, Charles sat down with Jonathan Dimbleby for a documentary marking 25 years since his investiture, and was asked whether he had been faithful. He said he had tried to be, until the marriage became irretrievably broken down. A future Supreme Governor of the Church of England had confirmed adultery on television. Which brings us to the 20th of November, 1995, and to the interview. It was recorded secretly in her own sitting room at Kensington Palace, with no palace officials informed. 22.8 million people in Britain watched it, roughly 2 in 5 adults in the country. She sat very still in heavy dark eyeliner and dismantled 15 years of official narrative in 54 minutes. She talked about the bulimia and about self-harm. She described the household's response as a determination to see her as unstable rather than unhappy. She confirmed the affair with Hewitt. She said she did not expect to be queen of the country and offered instead to be a queen of people's hearts. And she delivered the 10 words that ended any remaining possibility of reconciliation, about a marriage with 3 people in it and how crowded that had made it. It was devastating, and it was effective. And it was also, we now know, the product of a fraud. In May of 2021, Lord Dyson, a former Master of the Rolls, published the findings of an independent inquiry commissioned by the BBC. He found that the journalist who obtained the interview, Martin Bashir, had commissioned mocked-up bank statements, fake documents purporting to show payments to people close to Diana, and had shown them to her brother, Earl Spencer, in order to be introduced to her. Dyson found this a serious breach of the BBC's own standards. He further found that an internal BBC investigation in 1996 had been, in effect, a whitewash, and that Bashir had later been rehired into a senior position. The Prince of Wales, her elder son, responded with a statement of unusual coldness for a man in his position, that the interview held no legitimacy, that it should never be broadcast again, and that the failures of those involved had contributed materially to his mother's fear, her isolation, and her sense of being watched. He was 15 when it aired, and boys at school had seen it. And here the story does something genuinely difficult, which most retellings refuse to do. The interview was obtained by deception, and almost nothing she said in it was untrue. The affair was real, and had been confirmed by the other party on television 18 months earlier. The bulimia was real. The surveillance she described was, on the evidence of the intercepted calls, not a fantasy. The institution's preference for treating her as ill rather than as correct is documented in the memoirs of people who worked there. A forged document bought access to an accurate account. There is one further complication, and it is why historians will argue about this for another 50 years. At the time, Diana wrote a note in her own hand saying she had no regrets and that the interview had not been obtained under false pretenses. That note exists. Dyson considered it. One reading is that she was telling the truth, that she had decided to speak long before Bashir arrived, and the forgeries merely accelerated it. The other is that the note is itself the best evidence of how thoroughly she had been manipulated, a woman defending the man who fed her fabrications about her own staff. You cannot have both. Which one you choose determines whether the last great act of her public life was agency or the final thing done to her. The Queen wrote to both of them in December of 1995, urging divorce. It was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. The financial settlement was reported at around £17 million, plus an annual sum for her private office. She kept her apartments at Kensington Palace. She lost the style of Her Royal Highness, which meant, in the specific vocabulary of that family, that she was now required to curtsy to people who had been her in-laws for 15 years, including, in time, her own children. The households briefed against one another about who had insisted on the removal. The mechanism hardly matters. The message did not require a signature. She had been given the title as part of the transaction, and the transaction was over. She had entered the family at 20 and left it at 35, with a settlement, an office, and no rank. In June of 1997, she auctioned 79 of her dresses at Christie's in New York, raising over $3 million for charity. Look at what that act actually was, because it is the smartest thing she ever did, and it is almost always overlooked. So she took the decoration, itemized it, sold it, and gave the money to hospitals treating cancer and AIDS. The costume converted into the work. The train cut up and turned into something that did something. It was the last summer of her life. She died in the early hours of the 31st of August, 1997, after a car crash in a road tunnel in Paris. She was 36. William was 15. Harry was 12. The French investigation and the later British inquest both found the driver intoxicated and traveling at excessive speed, with the pursuing photographers a contributing factor, and no evidence of any conspiracy. Now do the arithmetic, because this family's story is always in the numbers. She was married for 15 years and 1 month. She survived the divorce by 12 months and 3 days. Of the 36 years she lived, she was inside that institution for 16 and famous for 17. She agreed to spend her life with a man she had met, by her own count, about 13 times, and then spent roughly 5,500 days married to him. 750 million people watched the wedding. Something in the region of 2.5 billion watched the funeral. Whatever else that proves, it proves the world was more interested in the ending than the beginning, and had been paying a particular kind of attention all along. So who was she? The honest answer is that the serious biographers have produced half a dozen incompatible women, and every one of them is working from an evidence base she partly wrote herself. Andrew Morton, whose 1992 book began the demolition and who revealed in 1997 that his source had been his subject, gives us a young woman crushed by a cold institution that treated her sickness as a discipline problem. Jonathan Dimbleby, in his 1994 authorized study, gives us a dutiful, doubting man pushed into a marriage by his family and his position, facing a partner whose illness he had no equipment to reach. Penny Junor, in Charles, Victim or Villain, published in 1998, within a year of Diana's death, went much further, arguing that Diana's instability was the primary destabilizing force in the household. The book was fiercely attacked on publication and remains the most contested account in the literature. Tina Brown, in The Diana Chronicles of 2007, rejects the victim frame for something harder, a genuinely wounded woman who was also a media strategist of the first rank and who understood before anyone in that palace did that the camera had become the Constitution. Sally Bedell Smith, in Diana in Search of Herself, published in 1999, reads the life through psychology and personality disorder, an approach other biographers regard as the same diagnostic weapon the household reached for while she was alive. And Patrick Jephson, her private secretary for 8 years, published Shadows of a Princess in 2000, a portrait of someone extraordinary and, by the end, extremely difficult to serve. Notice what they cannot agree on. Not the facts of the affair, which are settled. Not the illness, which is settled. What they cannot agree on is the direction of causation, whether the institution broke a fragile young woman, or a fragile young woman broke an institution, or whether both statements are simply the same 15 years described from opposite ends of the cathedral. Which is where we came in. From 90 feet away, on a July morning in 1981, 25 feet of ivory silk looked like the most beautiful thing anyone had ever seen. From 6 inches away, it was a mass of creases, because the vehicle they had put her in was too small to carry what they had asked her to wear. Nobody at the far end of the aisle could see that. That was the point of the far end of the aisle. And for 15 years, the arrangement held on exactly those terms. She was to be looked at from a distance, at which the damage did not register. And the one rule of the house was that she must never, under any circumstances, invite anyone closer. She broke it. With a book she pretended not to write, a photograph on a bench in Agra, a hospital handshake, a black dress on the night her husband confessed, and finally, 54 minutes in her own sitting room that we now know a man had lied his way into. And that is the cost, the real answer to the question we started with. She got the world to look up close. There is no version of this story in which she achieves that and also survives it, because the appetite that finally believed her was the same appetite that never once left her alone. They built her a fairy tale. It was too small to sit down in. Thank you for watching. If this one stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what you think the honest verdict is, because I do not believe there is a settled one. Subscribe for more of these, hit the bell so you do not miss the next, and there is another story waiting on the screen right now. I will see you there.